It was not just a base. Calling it that was like calling the ocean a puddle. The Special Operations Training Center, a world unto itself, was buried deep under many feet of rock and steel, scrubbed clean of any hint of the sunlit world above. Confidentiality was not just a policy here. It was the air you breathed, thick and odorless, recycled through vast humming systems that pulsed behind smooth, seamless walls. The place had no corners, just curves designed to funnel you along predetermined paths, sterile white corridors leading to sterile white rooms. Everything was cold, not just in temperature, a steady, impersonal 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but in feeling. It was a place built for purpose, and the purpose was singular, absolute. This was where the XCs were made, not born, made. The process was not something you endured, it was something you became. They took people, raw material, soldiers and others plucked from the edges of society, no questions asked, no goodbyes whispered, and they reshaped them. Alterations to their fundamental biological makeup, they called it, but it was more fundamental than that. A tweaking of the wires, a rewiring of the system, enhanced reaction times, quicksilver reflexes that ordinary folks could not dream of. Strength that was impossible, muscles coiling like compressed springs. And regeneration, a faster knitting of flesh, a quicker recovery from damage that would lay a normal person low for weeks. You felt it in your bones, in the hum of your blood, a constant, low-grade vibration that became the new normal. The physical conditioning was brutal, a relentless grinding down and building back up. Long marches under crushing weight, 50 to 60 pounds, over and over across simulated terrains deep underground, your lungs burning, your legs screaming, until screaming was not an option anymore. Sparring that was not about technique or winning points, but about survival, about absorbing and delivering punishment until your body ceased to recognize the concept of quitting. They pushed you past your limits, then showed you where the real limits lay, miles and miles further down the road. You learned to ignore pain, to function when every fiber of your being shrieked for rest. Rest was a weakness, but the physical stuff was almost easy compared to the psychological conditioning. That was the real work, the slow, deliberate stripping away of everything that made you you. Dehumanization, they called it. It sounded clinical. What it was an erasing. Your name, gone. Your past, an irrelevant dream. Your hopes, your fears, your little quirks and habits, sanded smooth. They did not want individuals, they wanted instruments. You were given a number, a designation, X1, X2, X3, up to X8. That was your identity. You looked at the others and you saw only their numbers, extensions of the same tool, parts of the same intricate machine. Friendship was not cultivated. It was actively discouraged. There was only tactical interaction, cold, efficient, necessary. You did not lean on someone. You moved in unison. They hammered one thing into your head day after day, cycle after cycle, the mission. The absolute sacred mission to protect humanity from Phase 3. They showed you images, simulations, descriptions. Phase 3 was a threat, mindless, savage, pure instinct. It was described as something monstrous, something evil, something to be feared, and most importantly, something to be destroyed without hesitation. They demonized it, painted it as the ultimate other, a force of chaos that had to be purged from the world. This single, unshakable truth was the only truth you knew. Everything else was noise. The team that was assembled for this first mission, this first venture outside the sterile confines of the Special Operations Training Center, was a unit forged in this underground fire. X1, the leader, was a veteran of the conditioning cycles, his face a mask of perpetual calm, his movements economical and precise. He was the center of gravity, the anchor point. X2 was the second in command, sharp, analytical, the only woman in the group. Her presence, even within the rigid structure, added a subtle, almost imperceptible shift to the dynamic, a different kind of stillness in the room. X3 was the youngest. His face still held hints of softness despite the hardening process, a faint edge of uncertainty beneath the practiced composure. X4 handled the tech, his hands moving with a quiet competence over the specialized gear. X5 was the sniper, his gaze distant, patient. X6 was the demolitions expert, a quiet intensity about him. X7 and X8 were the scouts, their job to range ahead, to be the eyes and ears of the team. 8 tools, honed and ready. This mission was not just a mission. It was the mission. The culmination of years of brutal training, endless simulations that felt real at the time, but they were, you understood now, merely practice swings. This was the first time they would face Phase 3 for real. The air in the briefing room, usually just the recycled hum, was charged, tight with unspoken tension. There was anticipation, a cold, sharp edge of readiness, but under that a different kind of tension. Anticipation mingled with a cold, sharp edge of dread. It was hard to name, hard to distinguish within the flattened emotional landscape. The briefing itself was concise, clinical. Phase 3 activity detected in the Smoky Mountains. The description of the target was simple and stark. Extremely aggressive, incredible strength, unbelievable speed. The simulations had shown them versions of this, blurring shapes moving faster than the eye could track, rending power that could tear through hardened materials. But simulations were not real. The mountains were. The final preparations were carried out with practiced efficiency. They checked the specialized weapon systems, sleek, dark things that were balanced and deadly in their hands. The ammunition magazines gleamed with the dull sheen of silver, stacked precisely in their vests. Sensors, thermal, sonic, motion, clipped onto gear, calibrated and checked. Medical kits packed with supplies designed specifically for lacerations from claws and punctures from fangs were double-checked. Every strap, every buckle, every piece of equipment was accounted for. Years of grinding repetition, reducing complex tasks to muscle memory. Standing there, surrounded by the low hum of the facility, the scent of recycled air, the quiet clink of gear being secured, the anticipation was a physical weight in your gut. After all the years, all the sweat, all the deliberate erasure, the real hunt was finally here. The Smoky Mountains awaited. A place out there, beyond the concrete shell, beyond the sterile corridors, where the world was not controlled, was not simulated. A place where Phase 3 was real, and they were the ones sent to kill it. It felt right, like the circuit was finally closing. The Special Operations Training Center, the cradle of the hunters, had done its job. They were ready. They had been built for this, stripped down and rebuilt for this singular purpose. Hunt, destroy, protect. That was the mantra. And the Smoky Mountains were the proving ground. You could almost taste the outside air, the damp earth, the pine needles, even deep down here. It tasted like the unknown. It tasted like mission. It tasted like blood. The recycled air suddenly was too thin. It was time to go. Time to see if the machine they had become was truly capable. Time to see if the truth they were fed was the whole truth. The countdown was more internal than external. No loud pronouncements, just the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the quiet finality of sealed doors, the vibration underfoot as transport mechanisms whirred to life. The sterile calm of the Special Operations Training Center gave way to the unpredictable chaos of the real world. The world of Phase 3, the world of the hunt. And they were about to step into it. Weapons loaded with silver, eyes focused on the mission, every fiber of their enhanced bodies primed for the encounter. The low hum of the facility faded, replaced by the rising anticipation of what lay ahead. The machine was primed. The briefing was not delivered by a person. It was a voice, flat and devoid of inflection, emanating from speakers set flush with the walls. It was the voice of the Special Operations Training Center itself, the impersonal authority that guided their lives within the complex. On screens that flickered to life, displaying data streams and blurred images, the mandate unfolded. There were photos, grainy and unsettling. A glimpse of indistinct movement vanishing behind trees. Massive, irregular gouges in the bark of old-growth timber. Places where the ground was disturbed, torn up. Scenes of disappearances, locations in and around the mountains where locals, hunters, hikers had simply vanished, leaving behind little or nothing. The information was not just presented. It was framed, filtered, given a dramatic weight that was deliberate, designed to instill a specific perspective. Phase 3, the voice explained, was classified as a high-danger biological anomaly. Uncontrollable. Possessing primitive intelligence, driven primarily by instinct. A wild, unpredictable force. The X's absorbed this, processed it. It fit the narrative they had been given, the image of a mindless, savage threat. There was no reason to doubt. Doubt was a malfunction. The Smoky Mountains had been chosen for specific reasons, the voice continued. Their remoteness was key. It minimized the risk of contamination or exposure to the civilian population. The dense vegetation provided concealment. The frequent fogs created perfect cover. It was, in essence, a natural containment area, an ideal testing ground. The historical reports of disappearances served as official justification, proof of the threat's long-standing presence, the reason intervention was necessary now. The mission objectives were clear, unambiguous. Locate the target, localize its activity within a defined area, and, ultimately, destroy it. Protocols were strict. Minimum contact with the outside world, complete autonomy in the field, lethal force authorized without hesitation. Capture was not an option. Liquidation was the only outcome. The voice laid it out with cold, clinical precision, outlining parameters, engagement rules, reporting procedures. It was a mandate from the shadows, delivered by an unseen hand. Their gear was specialized, built for this specific kind of hunt. The weapons, as mentioned, were adapted for silver rounds. The voice explained the rationale. Silver had proven effective against this particular anomaly in theoretical models. The detectors were thermal scanners, useful in clear conditions, but acknowledged to be less effective in the thick fog characteristic of the mountains. Ultrasound sensors were also included, designed to pick up high-frequency vocalizations or movements beyond the human range. They carried lures, chemical attractants designed to draw out the target, and the specialized medical kits for treating claw and fang injuries. Every item was a testament to the perceived nature of the threat. A beast, albeit an extraordinary one. The last hours within the complex were spent in the quiet rhythm of final checks. Pouches secured, straps tightened, communication devices checked and rechecked. X1 moved with his usual calm authority, his focus absolute. X2, analytical and sharp, went over maps and potential entry points, her concentration a palpable force. There was a professional intensity about them, a readiness forged in years of simulated combat. X3, the youngest, showed the faintest signs of nerves. A hand lingering too long on a weapon grip, a quick, darting glance around the sterile room. Small tells, but noticeable in the otherwise controlled environment. The others displayed their readiness in different ways. Quiet breathing exercises, meticulous wiping down of gear, a tightening of the jaw. The transport was a helicopter, taking off under the cover of darkness. Strapped into their seats, the dull thrum of the rotors of physical vibration, they ascended from the underground complex, the world outside a rumor until now. Looking down as they flew towards the target area, the Smoky Mountains spread out below looked exactly as advertised, shrouded in mist, dark and indistinct under the night sky. They rose from the earth like a slumbering, ancient entity, the mist giving them a truly smoky appearance. They felt like they were flying not just into a location, but into an impression, a feeling. The transition from the sterile, controlled environment of the Special Operations Training Center to the vast, untamed darkness outside was stark. The air in the helicopter was different, colder, less processed. Below, the world was silent, a dark canvas punctuated only by the faint, distant lights of human habitation that quickly faded behind them. They were moving into an area designated for a specific purpose, an area where the rules of the known world thinned. The thought of setting foot on that ground, the ground where Phase 3 was rumored to roam, stirred something deep inside. It was not crippling fear. It was more primal, a recognition of vulnerability that the Special Operations Training Center had attempted to eliminate through training. They were stepping into the unknown, a place that was inherently hostile, even from thousands of feet above. The mountains, dark and brooding in the mist, swallowed the helicopter's noise, pulling them down into their silent embrace. The flight was long, measured in the slow passage of time marked by the vibration and the droning engine. They sat in silence, each man and woman processing the briefing, running through scenarios in their minds, preparing themselves for the reality of the hunt. The theoretical Phase 3 from the simulations was about to become the actual Phase 3. The targets on the screen were about to become flesh and blood, or whatever it was Phase 3 was made of. The silver rounds were heavier in their magazines. The detectors were colder against their chests. As the helicopter approached the drop point, the mist thickened, swirling below them like a vast, conscious entity reaching up. The mountains disappeared almost entirely, swallowed by the swirling gray. The feeling of isolation, already strong, intensified. They were going in blind, relying on instruments that might fail, stepping into a place that was determined to keep its secrets. The sterile, controlled world of the Special Operations Training Center was impossibly far away now. This was the real world, the world of the mandate. And the mandate was clear. Find the monster. Kill the monster. Do not let it get away. Do not let it get you. The helicopter did not land gently. It dropped, a controlled crash of metal and noise that slammed them onto the earth. Before the rotors had even wind down completely, they were out, spilling into the absolute blackness of the night, the rotor's dying gasp swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive silence of the mountains. The cold hit first, a damp chill that sank deep into your bones, different from the regulated temperature of the Special Operations Training Center. Then the smells: wet earth, decomposing leaves, pine needles thick and resinous, and under that, something else. Something faint and unsettling like wet fur, and something vaguely metallic. The air was thick, humid, clinging to your skin and clothes. Visibility was zero. Not poor, but zero. The fog was a physical presence, dense as cotton, swirling around them, muffling sound, stealing light. Their night vision goggles helped, turning the world into shades of green and black. But the fog distorted distances and shapes, making everything indistinct. Thermal scanners were almost useless. The ground, the trees, their own bodies were all close enough in temperature to merge into indistinct blobs of heat. The mountains themselves pressed in, looming unseen just beyond the impenetrable mist. A silent, watchful presence. They moved according to protocol, establishing a quick perimeter, their movements automatic, honed by countless repetitions. The terrain was rough. Unseen rocks and roots underfoot threatened to trip them in the near-total darkness. They used the lay of the land, unseen slopes and potential cover, to set their defensive positions. The mountains swallowed their movements, their quiet commands, the soft scuff of their boots on the damp earth. The squad split into search teams as planned. X7 and X8, the scouts, melted into the fog, their forms quickly becoming indistinguishable from the swirling mist. They would range ahead, probe the immediate surroundings, their movements light and silent. X1 took point with X3, the leader guiding the youngest member. X4, the tech, stayed with X5, the sniper, and X6, the demolitions expert, forming another group tasked with setting up initial monitoring points and preparing equipment. The splitting felt necessary for coverage, but it also introduced a vulnerability, a scattering of their strength in this blind, hostile environment. Every sense was on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every drip of moisture from branches, every imagined shape in the mist was a potential threat. Your hearing became hyper-tuned, straining to pick out anything that did not belong. But the overwhelming feeling was the unnatural silence. Normal forests at night had sounds, insects, birds, the distant call of animals. Here there was nothing. Just the oppressive quiet, broken only by the closest sounds of their own movements, magnified in the stillness. It was as if the mountain itself held its breath. Attempts to establish radio contact, both with the distant command headquarters and between the separated groups, were met with static and a frustrating crackling. Short bursts of communication were possible, enough to confirm position, but anything longer, anything detailed, dissolved into electronic noise. It amplified their isolation, their sense of being cut off. They were deep in the mountain's gut now, beyond the easy reach of the outside world. It was not long before the first signs appeared, not the target itself, but its passage. Indistinct tracks in the soft earth larger than anything they had seen before, their shape unclear through the fog and darkness. Unusual damage. A sapling bent over at an impossible angle, its fibers strained but not quite broken, or a patch of undergrowth flattened as if something immense had simply walked over it. Small details, easily missed if you were not trained to look. But to the X, they were whispers in the silence. Hints that something was here, something big, something moving through the darkness unseen. These were not enough to form a clear picture yet, but they tightened the knot of tension in your gut. The hunt was on. The target was real. They established their first temporary camp, or rather, a defensive position, huddled together in the thickest part of the fog. There was no possibility of relaxation. Guards were posted, their eyes straining against the green-tinged darkness, their ears listening to the unnatural silence. The fog swirled around them, sometimes thinning slightly, sometimes thickening, a moving, shape-shifting presence that seemed almost alive, a silent partner to whatever was out there. It felt like being inside something's mouth, warm and wet and dark, waiting for the teeth to close. The cold dampness permeated everything. Their gear was heavy, saturated. The air tasted metallic, not from fear yet, but from the mineral tang of the mountain itself. Every breath felt amplified in the stillness. The unnatural quiet was the loudest thing of all. It spoke of a void, an absence of life that was profoundly wrong. What kind of creature could silence an entire forest? What kind of presence could make every other living thing hold its breath? Hours crawled by, marked only by the changing of guards and the deepening sense of being watched. The mist did not offer concealment. It offered blindness. Blindness for them, perhaps, but not, they began to suspect, for whatever else inhabited this place. The faint, unusual smell drifted in and out on the imperceptible currents of air within the fog, a reminder that they were not alone. Something was out there, moving in this silent, blind world. Something that left behind hints of its passage. Hints that were just enough to unsettle, to raise the fine hairs on the back of your neck. The hunt had begun, but it felt less like hunting and more like being inserted into a predator's territory. And in this territory, in this thick, suffocating fog, the predator held all the advantages. They were blind. It, they suspected, was not. The next day dawned not with sunlight, but with a grudging gray light filtering through the persistent fog. It had thinned slightly, revealing the immediate surroundings, towering, dripping trees, moss-covered rocks, the damp, dark earth underfoot. But visibility still only extended 50 to 100 yards on a good stretch. The air remained cold and damp, smelling of wet wood and decay, with that faint, unsettling undertone that had been present since they arrived. The unnatural silence persisted, a heavy blanket over the landscape. The active search began, following the planned routes, moving cautiously through the uneven terrain. They relied heavily on their eyes now, scanning the ground, the trees, looking for any sign of the target's passage. The electronic detectors were still largely ineffective in the fog. The thermal scanners were mostly useless, and the ultrasound detectors picked up nothing but the whisper of wind or the drip of water. They were back to basics: tracking, observation, instinct. The findings became more frequent, more disturbing. They found huge paw prints in patches of soft ground twice the size of a man's hand, the claw marks deep and distinct. On trees, they saw deep gashes, ripped into the bark not at waist height but 7, 8, even 10 feet up. It was not just scratching. It looked like something had dragged immense claws down the trunks with incredible force. In one clearing, they found a young tree, 5 inches in diameter, not cut or broken, but simply ripped from the earth, its roots exposed in a jagged hole. The sheer, casual power required for such an act was chilling. Then came the animal remains. Not bones, not scavenged carcasses. These were fresh kills, or relatively fresh, ripped apart with a savage brutality that went beyond simple predation. A deer, torn limb from limb, organs scattered, its head twisted at an impossible angle. A smaller animal, unrecognizable, reduced to a bloody mess of fur and bone fragments. There were no signs of other predators, no tracks of coyotes or bears, no birds picking at the remains. It was as if whatever had done this had no interest in consuming its kill, or simply left nothing for others. It felt gratuitous, an act of pure destruction. X1, X2, and even X4, the tech specialist, spent time examining the evidence. They measured the paw prints, estimated stride length from disturbed patches, gauged the height and depth of the claw marks. They processed this data through the known protocols for Phase 3. The information fed to them back in the Special Operations Training Center. Size, strength, speed. The evidence pointed to something immense, capable of incredible force and rapid movement. But contradictions emerged. The sheer malice of the kills did not fit the profile of a mindless beast driven solely by instinct. The surgical precision with which trees were damaged, the seemingly deliberate nature of the destruction, it hinted at something more than just brute force. And then there were the vanishing tracks. They followed a clear set of prints, leading across a damp patch, through some undergrowth, and then nothing. The tracks simply stopped on flat ground in the middle of a clear space, or at the base of a sheer rock face with no discernible handholds. It felt impossible. It chose when and where to leave evidence. It knew they were tracking it. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. It was not just a vague discomfort. It was a physical sensation of being watched, like eyes on the back of your neck. You caught a flicker of movement at the edge of your vision. A shadow detached itself from the fog or the trees, only for it to vanish when they turned their heads. You felt a sudden chill, a sense that something was incredibly close, breathing the same damp air. The invisible presence was not just out there. It was all around them, moving in the blind spots, just beyond the edge of sight. Paranoia began to creep into the ranks, a corrosive acid eating away at discipline. You found yourself glancing nervously at your teammates, wondering if they saw it too, if the fear was visible on their faces. Internal tension simmered just beneath the surface. X1 maintained his stoic facade, his face impassive, his orders delivered in a low, steady voice, but his eyes, constantly scanning, missed nothing, and the set of his jaw was tighter than usual. X2, the analyst, worked through the data, cross-referencing the new findings with the Special Operations Training Center protocols, but a crease had formed between her brows, and a flicker of concern and doubt appeared in her eyes. X3, the youngest, was clearly struggling. He jumped at sudden noises, his movements were jerky, and he scanned the trees with frantic intensity. The rest of the team showed the strain in different ways. A nervous clearing of the throat, a constant shifting of weight, an almost desperate cleaning of equipment that was already spotless. The mountains shrouded in fog and silence were less a hunting ground and more a cage. The evidence they found was not just traces of a beast, it was deliberate messages, signs left for them to find. And the vanishing tracks, the constant feeling of being watched, the unnatural silence. It all added up to a single, terrifying conclusion. This, Phase 3, was not the mindless animal they had been trained to expect. It was intelligent. It was aware of them. And it was playing with them. The hunt had flipped. They were not the predators here. They were the prey. And the phantom they were chasing was not merely an illusion. It was very, very real. The mountain was not just hostile, but actively malevolent. A vast living entity that had lured them into its depths. They had walked into a trap, and there was no easy way out. The silence that enveloped the clearing was the creature's mocking laughter. They were exposed, vulnerable, and the hunter was no longer the hunted. They were deep in enemy territory, and the enemy knew they were there. The mission was no longer about hunting Phase 3. It was about surviving it. And looking at the scene of absolute devastation, survival suddenly was an impossible dream. The clean, sterile world of the Special Operations Training Center felt like a distant, naive fantasy. This was the reality. And it was steeped in blood and terror. The morning routine began like any other in the field. Cautious movement through the fog-shrouded landscape, senses heightened, weapons ready. X7 and X8, the scout team, were on point, moving through their designated sector with the quiet efficiency that years of training had ingrained. They were professionals, moving as a single unit, their communication minimal, precise. Brief coded messages crackled over the short-range communication devices, reporting their location, the terrain, any signs of activity. It was standard procedure, the familiar rhythm of a patrol. Their last message was utterly routine. Confirmation of their current coordinates, a brief description of the terrain, a rocky incline leading into a denser patch of timber. Nothing more. It ended abruptly, not with a sign-off, but with the click of the transmit button being released. At the time, it went unnoticed, just another piece of routine communication in the background of the constant scanning and movement. Then came the silence. X1 initiated the next scheduled check-in. X7 report status. Only static answered. A split second of confusion, a fractional pause in the unit's movement. X1 repeated the call, voice steady but with a new subtle edge. X7, X8 acknowledge, still only static. The silence on the frequency stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. X2 tried the backup channel. More static. They tried encrypted bursts, coded pings. Nothing. Just the hiss and pop of a dead channel. According to protocol, silence from a unit meant immediate halt and listen. The remaining team members froze, melting into the cover of trees and rocks. They listened, straining their ears not just for a radio signal, but for any sound at all from the direction X7 and X8 had taken. The mountain silence, already oppressive, now felt deafening, accentuating the absence of the expected radio chatter. There was no outward panic, no shouted questions. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. But anxiety, sharp and cold, began to coil in your stomach. X1 made the decision. X2, take 4. Move to their last reported location. X3, X4, you're with me. X5, maintain a watchful position from here. Guard the gear. The order was curt, decisive. X5 melted back into the dense cover, finding a position with a view, or what passed for a view in this fog-bound world. X1 led his small group, X2 leading hers, moving towards the coordinates. Maximum caution was the order of the day. Every step was measured, every shadow scrutinized. As they approached the designated area, the feeling of something being wrong grew stronger, more pervasive. The air was colder here, even within the general chill of the mountains. The oppressive silence deepened. If it was possible, the normal, subtle sounds of the forest felt even further away. And that faint, unusual smell, the one that was like wet fur and something else, something animal and deeply unsettling, was stronger here. A faint but distinct odor that hung in the damp air. It tasted metallic on your tongue. The terrain matched the last report. A rocky slope covered in thick brush, leading down into a small, densely wooded hollow. They moved slowly, weapons raised, eyes scanning the green-tinged world through their night vision. They expected to find them injured, perhaps, or pinned down. They expected a scene of struggle, but they did not find bodies. They found the scene of an attack, yes. The signs were everywhere. But X7 and X8 were simply gone. The last known location of the scout team held no sign of the scouts themselves, living or dead. Just the horrifying, silent evidence of whatever had found them here in the mist. The silence on the radio was not equipment failure. It was something far, far worse. It was final. The small clearing at the bottom of the rocky slope was where the signal had cut out. The trees here were thick, old-growth timber, their lower trunks obscured by the fog. The ground was churned up, wet earth torn and disturbed. This was not just the passage of a large animal. It was the aftermath of something violent, something that had used immense force. X1 signaled a halt, his hand raised. They spread out, cautiously scanning the area. The air here felt heavy, charged with residual energy, a cold, lingering dread. The silence was absolute, broken only by the quiet sounds of their own breathing, the soft click of their weapons. There was no sound of wind, no drip of water, no birds, no insects, nothing. Just the mountain holding its breath, and the palpable sense of a void where two trained, enhanced operators should have been. The missing radio signal, the missing men. It all coalesced into a chilling understanding. Whatever had happened here had happened fast, and it had taken its prize with it. The hunter was still out there, and it had just claimed two of their own. The silence was its accomplice. The scene unfolded before them like a nightmare made real. It was not a field of battle in the conventional sense, with spent casings and enemy bodies. This was a place of brutal, overwhelming violence, delivered with terrifying speed. The ground was gouged and torn, earth and rock ripped up as if a colossal plow had been dragged through the small clearing. Trees nearby were scarred, the bark shredded by enormous claws. Some trunks bent at impossible angles. Others snapped clean off at a height of 8 or 9 feet, their wood splintered and jagged. It looked less like an attack and more like a tantrum by a force of nature. Evidence of the ferocity was scattered everywhere. Dark, viscous stains on the churned earth, on fallen leaves, spattered high up on tree trunks, blood, unmistakably. Shredded fragments of familiar dark gray uniform fabric, ripped and torn by immense teeth. Pieces of their specialized gear, a broken section of a rifle stock, a twisted metal frame from a backpack, a communication unit crushed into an unrecognizable mess of wires and plastic. The objects were not just damaged, they were broken, bent and twisted with a degree of force that made their enhanced muscles ache in sympathy. Even their specialized reinforced equipment was no match for whatever had done this. X1 and X2 moved through the carnage with grim efficiency, their training overriding the horror of the scene. The surviving members of the search team, their faces pale and tight, followed suit, scanning, processing, trying to make sense of the senseless. They identified the characteristic claw marks in the torn earth, confirming the presence of something with immense talons. The height of the damage on the trees corroborated their earlier findings. This creature was enormous, capable of reaching high up with ease. The sheer extent of the destruction, coupled with the limited area affected, suggested the attack had been incredibly swift, a sudden, overwhelming burst of violence. There were no signs of a protracted struggle, no defensive positions held, no evidence that X7 and X8 had even had time to mount a significant resistance. But the most shocking, the most unsettling detail was the absence of bodies. They scoured the area, expanding the search perimeter, their eyes straining in the fog, hoping to find some trace. Nothing. No bodies, no remains, not a single bone. X7 and X8 simply vanished. The creature left no trace of them. The complete absence of remains was deeply wrong. This was not how a wild animal behaved. Even the most savage predator usually left something behind, some evidence of its kill, some remains to be scavenged. It directly contradicted their understanding of Phase 3 as a mindless, instinct-driven beast. As they analyzed the scene, piecing together the fragments of evidence, X1 and X2 exchanged glances. A silent conversation passed between them, a shared, dawning horror. This was not a random encounter, a chance collision with a territorial animal. This was a targeted attack. The creature had not stumbled upon X7 and X8. It had found them, isolated them, chosen its moment, and struck with lethal precision. It had used the terrain, the fog, even the silence to its advantage. It had hunted them. The horrifying realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. Their training, their protocols, the very foundation of their understanding of the mission was based on a lie. The Special Operations Training Center classification of Phase 3 as a mindless, primitive anomaly was fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. This creature was not a beast. It possessed intelligence, cunning, the capacity to plan, to strategize, to conceal itself, to anticipate their movements. It was not just an animal. It was a predator with a mind focused on them. The paranoia that had been simmering now boiled over, flooding their minds. If the creature was this intelligent, this fast, this powerful, and it knew where they were, it could be anywhere, right now, watching them, hidden just beyond the veil of fog, observing their reactions, learning their tactics. The mountain was not just hostile, but actively malevolent, a vast, living entity that had lured them into its depths. They had walked into a trap, and there was no easy way out. The silence that enveloped the clearing was the creature's mocking laughter. They were exposed, vulnerable, and the hunter was no longer the hunted. They were deep in enemy territory, and the enemy knew they were there. The mission was no longer about hunting Phase 3. It was about surviving it. And looking at the scene of absolute devastation, survival suddenly was an impossible dream. The clean, sterile world of the Special Operations Training Center felt like a distant, naive fantasy. This was the reality, and it was steeped in blood and terror. The standard protocols were useless now. Engaging a mindless beast was one thing. Facing an intelligent, calculating predator was entirely another. X1, his face etched with a grim determination, discarded the Special Operations Training Center rulebook. Survival demanded improvisation. The team compressed, no longer splitting into smaller groups. They moved as one, a tight, cautious unit, constantly scanning their surroundings, weapons held at the ready. They established a moving perimeter, always aware of their flanks and rear, never letting their guard down. But their equipment, designed for tracking a predictable animal, remained frustratingly ineffective in the fog. The creature did not engage them in open combat. It did not need to. Despite their enhanced abilities, their training, their desperate attempts to fight back, the end was swift, brutal, and utterly unavoidable. Each attack was not just a kill. It was a calculated demonstration. The creature was not just eliminating threats. It was showcasing its power, its speed, its terrifying ability to appear precisely where they were most vulnerable, precisely where they did not expect it. It did not fear their weapons, their enhanced strength. It acted with utter confidence, almost contempt, and that was when it became clear it was playing with them. It allowed them a fleeting glimpse of itself, a massive shape melting back into the fog, just enough to spike their terror before vanishing again. It made sounds, a low growl that emanated from nowhere and everywhere at once, a snapping branch far too close, a rustle that mirrored their own steps. These were not random occurrences. They were deliberate actions designed to sow chaos, confusion, and fear. It was a psychological torment, a constant reminder that they were being watched, stalked, toyed with by something that found their terror amusing. Even X1, the picture of stoicism, showed the strain. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed. He was forced to constantly improvise, discarding protocol after protocol, trying desperate new tactics, splitting up then reforming, moving in unpredictable patterns, using what little cover they could find. But every plan, every attempt to gain an advantage, felt like it was anticipated, countered before it could even be fully executed. For the first time in years, maybe ever, his absolute certainty was shaken. The unshakable leader was running out of options. The state of X3, the youngest and least experienced, was rapidly deteriorating. He was exhibiting clear signs of panic, shaking uncontrollably, his breathing shallow and ragged, his eyes wide and darting frantically into the fog. He made mistakes, fumbling with gear, tripping over unseen obstacles, emitting nervous sounds. He had become a liability, his fear a palpable thing that spread through the remnants of the team, a contagious disease of the soul. But abandoning him was unthinkable. Another rule etched into their core, even if the Special Operations Training Center had tried to erase such sentiment. They were down to 3 now. X1, X2, X3. They looked at each other, battered and weary, the knowledge of their hopeless situation settling over them like the persistent fog. There was little chance of victory. The question was no longer if they would survive, but how long they could last. The mission was irrevocably failed. They had not destroyed Phase 3. Phase 3 had destroyed them, and retreat was impossible. It was not allowing it. It was driving them, pushing them deeper, prolonging the hunt, enjoying the game. They were the pawns, and the predator was moving them across the chessboard of the mountain, towards a final, inevitable checkmate. The realization was cold, stark, and absolute. They were going to die here. It was just a matter of when and how much longer the creature wanted to play. Physical exhaustion had settled deep into their bones. X1, X2, and X3 were bruised, scraped, their dark gray uniforms torn and stained with mud and sweat. They carried shallow cuts, remnants of brushes with the creature's claws or falls on the unforgiving terrain. Sleep was minimal, snatched in brief, terrifying snatches while one of the others kept watch. Food and water were running low, their bodies aching from the constant movement and the strain of being perpetually on edge. Their coordination was suffering, their thinking sluggish, clouded by fatigue and fear. Morale was hanging by a thread, frayed and almost broken. The loss of their teammates weighed heavily, a grief that was sharp and raw despite the Special Operations Training Center's attempts to suppress such emotions. It was compounded by the sheer horror of what they had seen, what they had experienced, and the crushing weight of their own helplessness. Questions gnawed at them, silent but persistent. What was this creature? Why had the Special Operations Training Center sent them here? So ill-equipped and misinformed. Who or what had lied to them? X3's state had deteriorated into outright panic. He trembled constantly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was a liability, stumbling, making noise. His wide, terrified eyes saw monsters in every swirl of fog. His fear was a palpable thing, a toxic cloud that threatened to engulf the others. X1 and X2 tried to speak to him, their voices low and steady, attempting to impose discipline, to calm him, but their words had no effect. He was lost in his own private nightmare. They found themselves approaching a mountain stream, its sound a low murmur under the pervasive silence of the mountains. It was 20 feet wide, shallow enough to cross in most places, but the banks were steep, and the rocks under the water slick with moss. Crossing it represented a significant risk. It was an open area, exposed with little cover. It was stepping onto a stage under the watchful eye of the predator, but the terrain behind them and on their flanks had been made impassable or too dangerous by the creature's movements. It had funneled them here towards this crossing. It was the only available route. The tension before attempting the crossing was almost unbearable. It vibrated in the air, a silent hum of dread. They went through the motions of conducting a perimeter check, scanning the mist-shrouded banks, the trees beyond. But it was futile, a hollow gesture. They knew with a chilling certainty that if the creature was waiting, they would not see it, would not hear it until it was too late. Every shadow was charged. Every drip of water sounded like a footstep. The feeling that the creature was expecting them, that this was its chosen ambush point, was so strong it felt almost physical, like a hand pressing on their chests. Slowly, cautiously, they began the movement into the water. X1 led, his movements deliberate despite his weariness. X2 followed, her analytical mind no doubt calculating the risks, finding none but the one they were taking. X3 stumbled along behind them, his fear making him clumsy. The cold water shocked their exhausted bodies, soaking their boots, chilling them to the bone. The rocks underfoot were treacherous, slick and unstable, threatening to send them sprawling into the frigid stream. The sound of the rushing water, normally a comforting sound in the wilderness, here only served to amplify their vulnerability, drowning out any other sounds, leaving them deaf to anything approaching. There was a pervasive sense of inevitability now, a heavy understanding that this was likely the end. Hope was a distant, unattainable luxury. They were taking this risk not because they believed they could survive it, but because there was simply nowhere else to go. The creature had driven them to this point, forced their hand. They moved through the water, their breath misting in the cold air, their eyes scanning the impassive wall of fog and trees on the opposite bank, waiting for the attack they knew was coming, bracing themselves for the swift, brutal end they had seen claim their teammates. The icy water was a premature embrace from the grave. It came from the fog, just as they were halfway across the stream at their most vulnerable. Not a gradual appearance, but a sudden, terrifying emergence. One moment the bank was obscured by swirling mist. The next, a shape detached itself with impossible speed, massive and dark, a nightmare-given form. It was Phase 3, but seeing it now in the flesh after witnessing its intelligence was infinitely more terrifying than any simulation. It was immense, a hulking, muscular body covered in dark, coarse fur that drank in the light and blended seamlessly with the shadows and the wet bark of the trees. It moved on powerful limbs that ended in paws tipped with foot-long claws, scraping against the rocks with a sound that sent a fresh wave of terror through you. Its head was wolf-like, perhaps bear-like, twisted and elongated, its snout filled with rows of dagger-sharp fangs. But the most horrifying thing was not its physical form, its brute power. It was its eyes. They glowed with an unnatural light, not the blank, instinctual stare of a wild animal, but with sharp, undeniable intelligence and something else. Malice. A cold, predatory awareness that spoke of thought and intent. It lunged, not randomly, but with terrifying purpose. Its target was X3, the one paralyzed by fear, floundering in the water. It covered the distance from the bank to the middle of the stream in a single, impossible bound. The attack was lightning fast, brutal beyond imagining. A flash of claws, a muffled shriek, and X3 was gone, simply obliterated by the creature's immense force. He had not even had time to raise his weapon, to get off a single shot. It had taken their most vulnerable member with casual, effortless cruelty, a chilling demonstration of its power against a trained, enhanced operative. X1 and X2 reacted instinctively. Years of conditioning activated despite the shock and the surge of pure terror. They brought their weapons up, opening fire with everything they had left. The silver rounds slammed into the creature's massive body with audible impacts. It recoiled slightly, a low growl rumbling in its chest, but it did not stop. The silver hurt it, yes? You could see it in the way its muscles tensed, but it did not slow it down significantly. The creature lunged at X1 and X2 now, entering the shallow water, spraying icy droplets as it moved. They were forced into close quarters, firing point blank, dropping their empty rifles, drawing their knives, swinging the stocks of their weapons, even attempting to use their stunners against its brute force. It was a desperate, frantic struggle against something that moved with unbelievable speed and possessed bone-shattering strength. As they fought, dodging swipes from its enormous claws, parrying blows that could kill, they heard it. Not just a roar, but something deeper, something horrifyingly familiar. A low sound emanating from its chest, a rumbling, guttural noise that, impossible as it seemed, sounded like laughter. A sound of pure, unadulterated enjoyment in their terror, in their struggle, in the act of killing them. It was not just a beast killing. It was a conscious entity reveling in their destruction. It added a new dimension to the horror, a layer of psychological torment that was almost worse than the physical threat. They managed to break away, not through any skill, but through sheer, desperate chance, combined with the creature's desire to prolong the game. They scrambled for the opposite bank, throwing smoke and flashbang grenades, anything to disorient it, to buy themselves seconds. The smoke billowed in the fog. The flashbangs exploded with blinding light and deafening noise, and they used the momentary confusion to pull themselves from the water, stumbling onto the rocky bank. They were alive. By a miracle, they were still alive. But they were wounded, bleeding, soaked to the bone, their ammunition almost gone, their energy depleted. They had survived the immediate onslaught, but they had not defeated it. They had only managed to fend it off, to retreat further into the mountain's embrace. And they knew with bone-deep certainty that it was still out there, watching, waiting. The revelation of its true form, its intelligence, and its chilling enjoyment of the hunt had stripped away the last vestiges of their preconceived notions. They were no longer hunting a monster. They were hunted by one. And this monster was not just killing them. It was savoring every moment of their fear. They were the last two left. Two wounded animals cornered by a predator that was smarter, faster, and infinitely more powerful than anything they had been trained to face. There were only two left, X1 and X2. They had found a small protected hollow, a shallow cave, nestled amongst some large boulders. It offered a brief respite from the fog and the creature, a chance to catch their breath, to assess their situation. The grief for the fallen was a heavy, silent weight in the air between them, mixing with the pervasive odor of wet earth and the lingering metallic tang of blood, their own this time. They were both wounded. X1 had a deep gash across his arm from a glancing blow, bleeding sluggishly. X2 had a nasty cut on her leg, making every step a painful ordeal. Their uniforms were torn, their bodies aching, hypothermia a real threat in the damp mountain air. Their analysis was cold, pragmatic, stripped bare of any emotion. Direct confrontation meant death. They had seen that clearly in the stream. Running was impossible. The creature was too fast, the mountain its domain. They had almost no ammunition left. Their strength was failing. They were cornered. But the encounter at the stream had given them something else. Something the Special Operations Training Center data had never suggested. Intelligence, malice, and arrogance. It had played with them, prolonged the kill. It had shown itself not out of necessity, but out of a desire to instill terror, to savor their fear. It knew it was superior. It was too confident. And in that confidence, they saw a vulnerability. X1, despite his wound and exhaustion, his mind sharpened by desperation, formulated a plan. A desperate, almost suicidal plan. A trap. They would use themselves as bait, a final, concentrated effort using the terrain and the meager resources they had left. They needed a location, a place where they could concentrate their remaining firepower, limit the creature's terrifying speed and maneuverability. They found it not far from the stream, a small clearing 40 feet across, enclosed on three sides by sheer rock faces that rose 20-30 feet high. The fourth side opened onto a narrow passage, the only way in or out, barely 10 feet wide, choked with boulders and fallen timber. It was a natural bottleneck, a perfect kill zone if they could lure the creature in. Working quickly, their movements stiff with pain and exhaustion, they set their trap. They pooled their remaining silver rounds, loading them into a single rifle. They gathered the last of their explosives, compact charges designed for breaching or demolition. X6 had taught them well. They masked the charges amongst the rocks and fallen timber in the narrow passage, carefully incorporating fragments of twisted metal from their destroyed gear. Anything shiny, anything that would mimic the reflective quality of silver or ice, something to draw the creature's attention and enhance the blast. They wired the charges together, leading the detonator wire back into the clearing, hiding it under leaves and dirt. They planned the activation, a simultaneous detonation designed to catch the creature in the confined space. Then came the waiting. Hours stretched into an eternity. The fog remained thick, cold, a suffocating blanket over the mountain. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every drip of water from the trees sounded like the creature approaching. The silence, when it returned, was even worse, charged with anticipation. Psychological tension reached its breaking point, tightening every nerve, every muscle. They huddled in the small cave, watching the narrow entrance to the clearing, their eyes gritty with exhaustion, their bodies aching. In the dim gray light filtered by the fog, they looked at each other. X1's face was a mask of grim resolve, but the fatigue was evident in the lines around his eyes. X2's analytical detachment was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability, a deep-seated fear that she no longer tried to hide. But in their eyes, you also saw something else, a shared understanding, a silent agreement. They were going to die here, but they would not go quietly. They would try to take the monster with them. This was not about victory anymore. It was about a last act of defiance, a final, desperate gamble against a fate that was already sealed. The last hope, thin and fragile as spider silk, rested on the creature's overconfidence. They were ready, as ready as two broken, bleeding humans could be. The cold mountain air held its breath, waiting for the final act to begin. It did not rush in this time. It approached the clearing slowly, deliberately, emerging from the fog not with a charge, but with a calm, measured stride. It knew they were here. It had herded them, played with them, driven them into this corner. This was not a wild beast accidentally stumbling into a trap. This was a predator walking towards its captured prey, utterly confident of its victory. The calm surety of its advance amplified the terror, making its immense fur-covered form even more horrifying. The final fight began. X1 and X2 moved as one, their movements fluid despite their wounds, years of brutal training activated at the most primal level. They used the rocks for cover, maneuvering within the small clearing, drawing the creature further in. They opened fire with the single loaded rifle, the silver round striking its massive body. It roared in pain and fury, its glowing eyes fixing on them, but it did not falter. The silver heard it. Yes, you could see it in the way its muscles tensed, but it did not slow it down significantly. X1 saw his chance. As the creature lunged, momentarily focused on X2, he broke cover, the detonator in his hand, sprinting towards the narrow passage where they had set the explosives. It was a desperate, suicidal dash. X2 laid down suppressing fire with her pistol, trying to distract the enraged creature. The tension in the clearing was a physical force, squeezing the air from your lungs. X1 reached the passage, his hand moving towards the activation button. But the creature was impossibly fast. even wounded and enraged. It shifted its immense body with lightning speed, pivoting away from X2's fire, swiping at X1. It dodged the main force of the blast at the very last second, a blur of motion faster than the eye could follow. The explosives detonated with a deafening roar, shaking the ground, sending splinters of rock and wood everywhere. Shrapnel ripped into the creature's side. It howled in pain, but it was still standing. Still a terrifying engine of destruction. It was wounded, yes, but not mortally. Enraged, bleeding, it turned on X1, who was staggering from the blast, the detonator still clutched in his hand. There was no time to react, no time to defend. The creature lunged, its immense claws a blur. It killed him swiftly, brutally, with the same casual ease it had shown with X3, with X6. X1, the stoic leader, the most skilled among them, was utterly powerless against the creature's raw, overwhelming power. He simply ceased to exist. The creature turned its glowing eyes on X2, the last one standing. In her final moments, a flicker of shock, of disbelief at X1's sudden, violent end crossed her face, quickly replaced by a surge of defiance. She raised her pistol, tried to fire, but the action was futile. An immense paw, a casual backhand blow, struck her. The world exploded in pain, a chaotic mix of sensations. The biting cold of the damp earth, the metallic tang of blood, the rank smell of wet fur, and something else, something acrid and burning. Then silence, darkness, then the unexpected. The creature, standing over their broken bodies, began to change. The thick fur receded, flowing back into its skin like water draining away. Bones shifted and popped with sickening sounds. The massive form shrank, reshaped, becoming less monstrous, more human. Within moments where the beast had stood, a man stood. He was huge, yes, exceptionally muscular, covered in a latticework of thick, angry scars, but undeniably human. And his eyes, the same glowing eyes that had hunted them through the fog, were now filled with a chilling, intelligent focus. He reached into a pouch on his scarred, powerful leg and pulled out a standard-issue Army radio. The kind they used in the simulations, the kind they were told was too unreliable for this mission. He spoke into it, his voice deep, calm, utterly devoid of emotion. Alpha 24 calling Command Headquarters. Operation Smoky Mountains complete. Objective achieved. He paused, listening to the crackle of the reply. Group X, liquidated, destroyed in simulation. X2, captured alive. Another pause. Subjects X, proven incapable of confronting individual Alpha 24. Alpha 24, modifications demonstrate superiority. The horrifying truth, colder and sharper than the mountain air, settled over the scene. This had not been a hunt for a monster. It had been a test, a trial. They were not hunters. They were laboratory rats, disposable subjects in some grotesque experiment. The Phase 3 was not a wild anomaly. It was an experimental weapon, a successful prototype named Alpha 24. They had been sent here, lied to, sacrificed, simply to test the capabilities of another, earlier, more advanced subject. Soon the quiet returned, broken only by the distant thrum of approaching helicopter rotors. Not the clattering, functional sound of their insertion craft, but something larger, quieter, more sophisticated. Agents arrived, figures in clean, efficient gear that looked nothing like the battlefield attire of the XS. They moved with professional detachment, securing the scene, conducting a swift, clinical cleanup. X1's body was bagged and labeled a failed specimen. X2, barely alive, was carefully, almost reverently, placed in a specialized containment unit, a valuable subject for further experimentation. Alpha 24, the man who had been the monster, received medical attention, his wounds treated with efficiency, and was escorted onto one of the sleek helicopters, the successful outcome of the operation. The Smoky Mountains settled back into their silent, fog-bound mystery, keeping their secret. X2, drifting in and out of consciousness in her cold, dark container, was carried away into the unknown. Into a world where the real monsters were not creatures of legend hiding in the wilderness, but the men who created them, refined them, and used human lives as expendable components in their pursuit of something unspeakable. The betrayal was absolute, the dehumanization complete. The true face of the monster was not the fur and claws. It was the cold, calculating intelligence that had orchestrated it all, and the facility that had built the hunters only to feed them to their own creation.